Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this week's webinar. My name is Richard Orme. I'm from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host for today. Okay, let's get started. Each week, we invite you to suggest topics for future webinars or offer to share your knowledge and experience as a presenter. This week, we've an example of a suggestion that's grown into what I'm sure will be a highly informative hour on an important topic. We have two wonderfully knowledgeable and expert people who will explain how to leverage InDesign for accessible EPUB creation. So I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves and take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Brady. I am an ebook developer, currently moonlighting as a director of cross media at a small, medium-sized publisher in Toronto called House of Nancy Press. I've been making ebooks for quite some time and have gotten my fingers dirty in all manner of code and markup and specs and CSS and thinking about the future of EPUB and the reading experience from a broad variety of perspectives, including a print disabled one, which is part of what led me here today. Now I'll pass it over to my co-presenter, Michael.
Thanks very much, Laura. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Michael Murphy. I am a senior solutions consultant at Adobe, specializing in our Creative Cloud and Document Cloud platforms. Prior to joining Adobe, I spent 25 years as a hands-on designer, author, and host of an InDesign podcast called The InDesigner. So today I'm very happy to showcase features in InDesign that will power your EPUB workflow and ensure clean, consistent, accessible output. So here is a quick look at our agenda today. Laura and I will be splitting the presentation across our various areas of expertise. I'm going to start off talking about establishing structure through InDesign styles. And then Laura will talk about editing export tags. I'll come back and we'll talk about images and alt text. And then Laura will deliver the final segment on semantics and post-export cleanup. There's a note at the bottom that most of what we're talking about today is going to be specific to reflowable EPUBs. It is relevant to fixed layout, but just wanted to let everyone know up front that it is most pertinent to the needs of a reflowable EPUB. And with that, I'm going to kick off on establishing structure in your InDesign file using styles. There are a number of best practices that we'll cover today, but the most fundamental of them all is the proper and consistent use of styles, primarily paragraph, character, and object styles. Styles are essential to defining the appearance of content in a document, and they enable designers and production teams to quickly and efficiently make sweeping changes to formatting throughout an InDesign file. But they serve an even more critical role when producing EPUBs or other accessible content. They are literally the mandatory first step in how you prepare and prep your file and format its contents. That's going to cover about 70% or so, if not more, of the accessibility related and EPUB related tasks that will be part of your workflow. So let's take a quick look at styles themselves if you're coming to this relatively new. So a paragraph style describes the formatting of a paragraph, including attributes like the font, the size of the text, the leading, character spacing, etc. They also describe things like indentation, spacing before and after a paragraph, hyphenation, and a lot more. So anything about the paragraph as a whole is part of a paragraph style. In this example shown here, the different headings and body copy are each formatted using paragraph styles. Character styles describe exceptions to the formatting within a paragraph, like instances of bold or italic text. In this example, there's a drop cap character style and an italic character style. Each applies formatting that deviates from the overall paragraph style. In a conventionally viewed publication, these styles provide a designer precise control over the appearance of content on the page and keep it consistent throughout the entire document. However, from an accessibility standpoint, the appearance and presentation of the content is not the primary concern. So why do styles matter? Styles matter because they effectively mark the content that they're applied to. To demonstrate this, here in InDesign's story editor, where you're able to view text outside of the confines of the layout and its specific formatting, applied style names all appear in that margin next to their respective paragraphs. It's part of that text, part of the information about those paragraphs. And the selected text that you see in the story editor highlights the character style applied to it in the character styles panel. And this relationship of styles to content persists all the way through the export process. And it's your styles that will be the framework establishing your EPUB's HTML structure, as we'll see later in this session. It's extremely important to avoid and eliminate manual overrides in your text formatting. Manually applying things like bold and italic with, say, a keyboard shortcut instead of a proper character style means that those bolds and italics will be lost when you export to EPUB. So neither their appearance nor their accessibility attributes will be there. Ideally, you'd make it a habit to avoid any overrides as you work, but it's not a perfect world, and we all do this sometimes. For example, there's italic text selected in this paragraph. In the paragraph styles panel, the style name has a little plus next to it, indicating that an override to the style exists. When I hover over the style name, you see the tooltip that is exhibited with more detail, and it shows me that italic is the specific override here. And this is one way to find overrides in your document, but it requires deliberate selection of text to reveal that plus sign. So it can be a very tedious process. To speed that up, you can toggle on the Style Override highlighter. It's a small icon at the top of the paragraph and character styles panels. I've blown up an example of it here. And that highlights every override applied to any paragraph or character style throughout the entire document. This lets you very quickly get a visual sense of how many overrides you have, how much work is ahead of you, and you can then go through the document much more quickly and resolve and eliminate these overrides. In some cases, you may just be removing things like manually adjusted tracking or leading or some other random formatting that got applied. So you can use the Clear Overrides button at the bottom of the Paragraph Styles panel. And again, I've blown the icon up here so you know what it looks like. That'll eliminate anything that deviates from the paragraph style, and it'll and by having the paragraph style the way it's supposed to be with no overrides, you'll get the cleanest HTML built into your EPUB at the end. In some cases, though, you're going to actually want to preserve the formatting, but with an appropriate style instead of an override. That way, the desired formatting and emphasis will travel all the way through to the EPUB and be marked up correctly. In this example, I've got an italic character style that I can apply to this text, which makes my override highlighting go away. When the character style is applied, the little plus in the paragraph styles panel next to article-first goes away. When I look at the settings of that paragraph style, of that character style, the only attribute that's different from the paragraph's formatting is that it uses the italic variation of that typeface. With that applied, I've taken the first step to required to ensure this formatting makes the trip to my final EPUB. But I also want to point out that there's more I can do here with the character style. The italicized phrase is in Spanish, while the paragraph, and for the most part, the entire document, is in English. So for that, I want to apply a different character style. You can see it here in the character styles panel. Just below italics, I've applied a style called Spanish. It is exactly the same as my italics character style in appearance, except when I look at its settings under the advanced character formats, it's showing that the language has been deliberately set to Spanish. So anytime I apply this, it will both format it with italics and it will indicate that this text is Spanish and not English, which is important for an assistive reading device to know. So I'm packing a lot of information into the formatting and I'm applying it to my content with styles. So how does this markup information, the style information from InDesign, get translated to clean semantic HTML markup for EPUB? The secret behind this is a setting available for paragraph, character, and object styles called export tagging. And for each style you create, you can establish a connection to an HTML tag like P, H1, or H2 for paragraph styles, or M or strong for character styles. And this is an essential connection between your InDesign content and a clean, accessible EPUB, and it all starts with styles. If you aren't applying paragraph and character styles in this prescribed way, you are leaving your all of the work and burden on HTML cleanup later in the process. So this is a necessary first step. There's more to this export tagging piece, and for that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a feature in InDesign called Edit All Export Tags, which I like to think of as your EPUB superpowers. But first, I'm going to set the table for what drives that set of options in InDesign, and that's semantic HTML. Left to its druthers, InDesign will fill your EPUB with generic HTML like span tags and divs around nearly everything. All paragraph styles will default to a P tag, and all character styles will default to a span tag. And then finally, all object styles will default to a div tag. So I can hear you asking, does that really matter? Those divs and spans mean that the EPUB looks like it's supposed to, doesn't it? Putting accessibility at the center of how we make EPUBs means that we need to rigorously shift the focus from presentation to meaning. Michael alluded to this earlier, and I'm going to go on and on about it, I promise. Brace yourself. From a screen reader point of view, it doesn't matter one bit if the EPUB looks fine. What matters is that the HTML driving the EPUB is made with semantics in mind. Using precise HTML gives the markup meaning rather than the presentation, or only the presentation, that is. So let the HTML do some of the accessibility heavy lifting for you. There's a link on screen that is a really good explainer about semantic HTML, lifewire.com/y-use-semantic-HTML-3468271, just in case you can't see the screen. How does this HTML thing play out in practice? Let's say your content has some secondary content like a sidebar. InDesign will help you style that correctly, but marking it with the appropriate HTML, in this case an aside tag, will mean that a reader consuming your content via a screen reader will be given the option to skip that secondary content that's marked as asides to focus on the main narrative in the text. So rather than interrupting that reading experience, the reader can come back to that piece at their leisure. And in the school of thought that a well-made EPUB that meets accessibility guidelines is a better reading experience for a broad range of readers, mapping paragraph styles to a structural hierarchy will mean that there's a full navigation built into your EPUB, and thus that every manner of reader will thank you for that attention to detail. So how does that look in InDesign? With a little nudging, maybe even strong arming, InDesign will produce cleaner HTML. This depends a lot on your styles being as cleanly applied as possible, as Michael has already discussed. So step one is to open up a style palette. So in the screenshot on the screen, we're seeing the paragraph styles palette. There's a flyout menu in the upper right corner of that palette that presents a series of options. What I'd like you to do is to select all unused styles. So select all unused, and that will highlight all the styles in the paragraph styles palette that aren't in use at all. delete those. And then repeat that step for all the styles palette at use in your document. So character, object, table, and cell styles where relevant. Step 2. Go back to that same flyout menu and scroll down to Edit All Export Tags. This is the source of your InDesign to EPUB superpowers. This is Thor's hammer even. This screen will display all the paragraph, character, and object styles at use in the files. So earlier, Michael showed you how you can map a style to a specific tag, and here you can see everything at once. He showed it to you in a micro way on one style at a time. In this screen, you can edit them all at once and see a broad overview of what your HTML is going to look like in the EPUB. So from here, we can map to the appropriate tags. In this screenshot, you can see I've mapped the paragraph style. Go back one, still, Michael, sorry, that's okay. I've mapped the paragraph style CN, which stands for chapter number, to an H1 tag. And I've asked it to split the EPUB into chapter size HTML chunks based on that divider. The paragraph style at the top, called A head, is mapped to an H2 tag. In the document that this menu is from, there are 3 kinds of italics mapped to 3 different tags. One of the limitations of InDesign is the lack of robust options from this window. So if we go forward to the next slide, we can see a little bit of that. So for all of the paragraph tags, you can see that your options are a P tag or H1 through H6. Sorry, I just need to orient myself. And then the character styles, your options are to map it to a span or an M or a strong tag. And on object styles, your only options are a div or a span. Don't limit yourself to these options. There is a lot more HTML in the world. So if we'll go back one slide again, Michael, please. Thank you. You can see that I've opted out of InDesign's offerings in some places and just simply typed in the more appropriate HTML tags, like M, cite, or I tags for the various kinds of italics in the document, and a small tag for small caps. In the object style section, I've translated a basic text frame that starts each chapter to a section tag, and the images to a figure tag, and the frame that the caption sits in to a fig caption tag. So under that tag column, you have some options that are built into InDesign, but you can also type in better HTML. I would caution you that you can type in nearly anything and you're going to get HTML that's nonsensical. So be cautious and understand HTML and use it well. Just be aware of that. You can trip yourself up. So don't let all this power get to your head. Strong-arming InDesign like this will give me cleaner HTML. It's still not a perfect system. For example, the markup will need to be edited so that the fig caption tag is nested properly inside of the figure tag. At present, InDesign doesn't do nested HTML well at all, so please bear that in mind. And now I'm going to pass it back to Michael.
All right, thanks very much, Laura. We're going to talk a bit now about preparing images so that they fall in the flow of your document where they need to be, that they are appropriately presented for conventional display, and also are appropriately alt tagged for accessibility. So when designers are creating content for print, they have a lot of flexibility to work visually and precisely control where things like images and caps fall on any given page. On the printed sheet, it's a fixed format, and they have complete freedom to do that. So surrounding text can be pushed away by things like text wrap, and the layout and design intent remain fixed and intact. In a reflowable EPUB, however, that kind of control and visual placement doesn't survive the export process. As you can see here in iBooks, all of those nicely placed images from InDesign now fall at the end of my book or section, and that grouping of images from the InDesign layout is broken apart into separate images. Because of this, images in a document destined for reflowable EPUB need to be anchored within the text at the specific locations you want them to appear. Here you see an example of one of those images in a specific location as an anchored object. You can see the little anchored object adornment there on the top of the image frame. And its anchored object dialog shows the settings used to position this appropriately. Over to the left, I've also got the story editor display open here, and you can see that there's an anchored anchored image tag there in the flow of my story. So this image is part of my text flow. So right after the end of the previous paragraph in my EPUB, this image will be presented at that place, followed by its caption, and then the remaining text will continue after that. So, you know, that's how we get the images where we want them to appear. Let's look at how to specify how those images should be converted for the EPUB and how to tag them with alt text for accessibility. So when you are exporting for EPUB, the reflowable EPUB export options dialog that you will get presented with, that I'm showing here, there are two specific areas that you are going to be concerned with in terms of how your image files are handled. So those are object and conversion settings. And in the object settings, I always make sure that preserve appearance from layout is, that first checkbox up there, preserve appearance from layout, is checked so that things like image cropping are honored and preserved for the EPUB. I also choose from CSS size, I choose relative to text flow, so that my size values in the CSS will be defined by percentages instead of fixed values. And because you never know how large or small a device your book will be viewed on, so this is my recommended setting. And although it's not checked by default, which is the way it should be, I just want to mention that ignore object export settings box should never be checked. We'll talk about object export settings in a moment, but trust me, always leave that unchecked. In the conversion settings, it's fine to leave format as automatic instead of choosing a specific option like JPEG or PNG if you want InDesign to determine the best image format for you. If you want to standardize on one, you can choose from that menu to default to, you know, a specific image format. Below that, you'll see that if you rely on automatic, it tells you, you know, how it's going to format JPEGs, GIF images or GIF images, however you, whichever side of that camp you fall into, and what compression level PNGs will be saved at. And you can change some of those settings with predefined values. But this is a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to exporting your images. It means that every image, unless you specify otherwise, every image is going to be exported in this specific way. And that certainly reduces the work you have to do in terms of defining how images get exported. But there are two things to consider here. The first is that nothing in these settings takes into account, well, nothing in these settings apply alt text to your images, and that's essential. And it doesn't take into account that you may have images you want treated differently, like the group of images we saw in the layout earlier. And to meet those specific needs, you'll have to delve into object export options in your layout. Object export options are where you tag your images with alt text for accessibility and also specify how images will be handled when they're exported. If you right-click or control-click on any image, you can choose object export options from the context menu. In the object export options dialog, there is an alt text area, and by default, alt text is generally set to from structure, which assumes that there is some XML structure in the document, which for just about every new document, there isn't, and there isn't any in mine. So I can choose something else, like, for example, XMP metadata. If I choose XMP description, I see that there actually is some metadata that's been added to this file, and it says ruins of the warden's house on Alcatraz Island. So that's fine for a caption, but it's not necessarily good alt text, since alt text requires describing the image in more basic terms. So instead of XMP description, I can choose custom and type in my own text. So for example, here I might say, photo of the empty remains of a building. And that basically describes what the image is of. The caption would then elaborate in different terms, but this would be read out as alt text, indicating what the picture actually is. And I would need to do this, I would need to do this for all of the images that are going to be in my EPUB. The other area of this dialog we want to quickly take a look at is the EPUB and HTML options. And that's that third tab over on the right, same dialog. So here I can largely rely on some of the defaults. So, but this is going to tell me how images are going to be rasterized, in what format they're going to be saved, and other aspects of their final visual appearance in the EPUB. And that's going to be important even without necessarily being an accessibility function. So while we're here, I just want to mention there are a few options you can choose for rasterization. By and large, default is pretty good, but for certain reasons, and we'll see an example in a moment, you might want to choose rasterize container or content, or use existing image for graphic objects if perhaps you need SVG support. But generally, I feel like default is good enough. But one thing that I tend to make sure I set here is, again, like I showed in the export options, that this is relative to the text flow. The size of the image will be relative to the flow of the text, again, meaning that it will be percentage based instead of specifically to a specific pixel dimension. For example, in the final EPUB, this will just say that this image is 100% of the overall width of the page or the screen that it's being presented on. So those are the options I go with there. Here's an example where I might make a change to the preserve appearance from layout setting. So we're looking at the spread now that has the group of images, the 4 images kind of arranged nicely. And really they're just a sort of collective set of images that are intended to support the caption below. But those are going to be, I want those to appear as a single image. And to do that, they're grouped. So I have the layers panel showing here that shows that this is a group nested inside, or anchored inside rather, my text frame. So this is in here and it's anchored. So that's correct in the way I want it. It is grouped. And since I want it to remain in this appearance as a single object, I've chosen rasterize container in my settings. So that means this set of 4 images will rasterize out as a single image because it's a group. Now, also because it's a group, I have to go ahead and add specific alt text here. I would have to do this for any image if I wanted custom alt text, but for this, let's say I was relying on my XMP descriptions because my metadata was written with accessibility in mind, for example, because that speeds up my workflow. If that's the case, any of the images that already had metadata, I'm not going to see any of that because now they're a group. None of their metadata is going to be passed on through the EPUB export process because the object is now a group. And I have to give the group its own alt text. So here I've just called it a series of images of different structures on Alcatraz Island. I'm not a professional in the writing of alt text, so don't hold me to task on that. But that's what I've put in here, just something that indicates that it's multiple images and what they are. And in the end result, what I'll end up with, unlike what we saw much earlier, is I have all my images flowing appropriately, appearing within the text according to the flow because they've been anchored. The images there occupying the space I want within that page. It will adapt if I orient the device vertically. The caption follows it. My group is a single image presented the way I wanted it to appear. And that's what I get by setting this up. I get the order, appearance, and alt text as I want it in my final EPUB. Before I turn it back over to Laura, I want to throw in a little tip about object styles, because I mentioned object styles earlier. Laura mentioned it in her edit all export tags. This image that I've placed within my text in the sample layout here, the image of the building, is anchored in my text, as we've discussed, and the object style panel is open here in the center, and it's highlighting image inline custom export. So I've applied an object style to this image for a number of reasons. And let's look in the object style options dialog over to the right, because I want to give you just this tip about how powerful object styles can be and how helpful they can be in your EPUB and accessibility workflow, because the object style can include export tagging. We saw that with paragraphs and characters. So here, following Laura's guidelines, I have put my own tag in, not a div tag like InDesign wants me to choose, but I've put my own custom tag in of figure. So that option is in here and can be built in. So anytime I apply the object style to an image, it will automatically include this tagging and save me that step. Additionally, down here, I've got an alt text field. This is all the stuff we saw in the object export options dialog. I can set it all here. Now, the only time I would recommend adding your alt text here is if you know you can reliably choose from something like XMP metadata. So if you know that your XMP description of that image is written in there, that means if you apply this style with alt text turned on and to default to that description, every unique description will be applied to every object you used on this, use this object style on throughout your document. And that can be really fast, but you have to have somebody who likes doing metadata and can write it to proper accessibility standards in all of your images. If you don't have that, which most of us don't, then what I would recommend is unchecking the alt text box down there where it's highlighted with the red box. Uncheck that box so that that attribute is ignored. You don't want to wipe out metadata for every image you apply this to. So it may be safer in most cases to turn off alt text in your object style. And here again, here are your rasterization settings for EPUB and HTML. We're not going to go over this again. It's exactly what we saw in the dialog box when I did it image by image. And then just to show you a little bit of a hint here, one thing that's also built into an object style is its anchored object options. So that means any image I import and then apply this style to and cut and paste into my text will automatically anchor in the exact same position. So I can save that as the object style. That saves me having to manually do that for each of those images, because I am going to anchor them and I do have to work in this file. So I need it to flow in a consistent way, and I need whatever leg up I can to get my work done. So this, again, not necessarily an accessibility factor here, but it is something that will help you speed up your workflow, so you can go back and have the time you need to focus on accessibility and check your alt text and all that other stuff. And just recently, InDesign, Adobe InDesign added the ability to do size and position as part of an object style. So I actually can use this object style along with frame fitting to physically size my image to the width of my text. That, again, is just for me as the person putting this all together, but it sizes my image, it fits it to the frame, it applies my anchored object settings and any number of other objects with a single click, and I can proceed there and then have free up all that extra time in my day to focus on the important accessibility stuff to follow in my export. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Laura.
Hi again. Okay, I am going to start talk about semantics, scripts, and post-export editing. There's quite a lot to fit in here, and I want to leave lots of time for questions, so I'm going to try to whiz through this a bit. I want to circle back to that thing that I go on and on about, semantics. InDesign has a full set of EPUB type semantics built in. They are an additional layer of semantic inflection that can be applied at the object level to provide an outline or the bones of the content. So the screenshot on the screen right now on this slide is of the object export options window, and there's an EPUB type line with a flyout menu at the end at the right that shows the full set of EPUB type options. This is the full set as defined in the 2011 EPUB 3 spec. These kinds of semantics are used to denote the start of the front matter, the body matter, and the back matter, and they can also be used to label the many, many elements of book-like content. So, for example, the behavior of pop-up footnotes in the reading systems in which that's supported, it's driven by EPUB type semantics. The bad news is that EPUB type semantics are essentially meaningless. They are not taken up in any meaningful way by any reading systems. So I would encourage you to think of EPUB type as scaffolding upon which to layer the more meaningful ARIA roles. There are tools out there. For example, there's a tool called Green Light from Circular Flow, and a link to that is in the resources at the end of the slide deck, that will help you map EPUB type roles to ARIA roles. I freely admit that this is an imperfect workflow and more than a little kludgy, but until the InDesign engineers update these semantics, this will have to do when InDesign is a major part of how you get to the EPUB stage. So the two links on the screen right now are to the IDPF EPUB type vocabulary and to the DAISY knowledge base, which is an indispensable tool and should be bookmarked in your browser if you're making ebooks. And this link goes directly to ARIA roles and the explanation of ARIA roles and how to use them. I have a few more tricks up to my sleeve that I'd like to share with you. One major element of the accessibility picture is page list. A page list is a print corollary marking and listing of the page print breaks in a book. InDesign will not assemble this list for you, unfortunately. I worked closely with a man named Chris Copeters of Rorohiko Workflow Resources, a scripter extraordinaire, and he has created an InDesign script that will insert conditional text at the precise page break. And then the second link on this screen, so one link is to an EPUB Secrets article about how to use page list and why, and it tells you how to get that page list script. And the second link is to another set of scripts that Chris wrote that will do all kinds of magical things like assemble the page list in the navigation document, create a meaningful HTML title, and other general InDesign exported EPUB cleanup tasks. I would encourage all ebook developers to think of an InDesign exported EPUB as a starting point. It is not a finished product, not if you care about accessibility or good development best practices. The list on this screen is a set of post-export cleanup instructions that me and the ebook developers in my department use to clean up an EPUB. No matter how cleanly styled an InDesign file is, it has an inexplicable tendency to apply overrides at the paragraph, character, and object style level. And so you should, in a global way, just sort of nuclear blast those out of your EPUB document. The default CSS that InDesign exports is hugely problematic. InDesign just doesn't do CSS well by any measure. I would encourage you to insert your own bespoke CSS at EPUB export, but if that's not an option, then you must edit the InDesign generated CSS down. At minimum, you should take out the black text definitions. So black text in InDesign will be exported with color definitions. So if your base body style has a color definition of black, it may actually disappear when a user reads in night mode in some reading systems. And all text will have hard pixel dimensions, which may get in the way of resizing in some reading systems. The ability to change the font size and the font are foundational to accessibility, so don't let InDesign CSS undo the good work you've done to make an accessible EPUB. Check the navigation. Is it as full as you want? Are the lists and sublists nested properly? There's a good chance that the nesting went sideways on export and that will need some attention. Add a full set of accessibility metadata to your EPUB. Again, go to the DAISY knowledge base and copy the accessibility metadata there into your document and then modify it as required to meet the needs of your content. There's a tragic InDesign bug that inserts Arabic language tags into non-Arabic content. It might mess with how your numerals are exported, or it might cause your content to be read right to left in some reading systems. Be very cautious to mark language shifts via a unique character style, as Michael showed earlier, but delete language tags that aren't relevant. So be mindful of, particularly of the Arabic language tags getting inserted into your content when they're not meant to be there. Additionally, move all language declarations in the HTML file up to the root HTML level. InDesign puts the document language declaration on the body tag, and that's not the right place for it. Fix up the HTML. So nest fig caption tags in the figure tags, that's going to have to be done. It's not going to export correctly from InDesign. Migrate any remaining div tags to more meaningful HTML, and add an HR tag. So pointy bracket HR space / pointy bracket to denote an editorial space or context break. That's not going to come out of InDesign on its own, and that's something you're going to have to add later. And then finally, run your EPUB through EPUB Checker and through Ace by Daisy to see where you stand and to make sure that you don't have any validation errors in your ebook, and then through Ace by Daisy to see how your EPUB measures up against accessibility standards. The next slide is a set of resources. This is really dense, and you will be able to get access to the slides later, I promise. You don't have to quickly write this all down or take a screenshot. There's lots of things here that are very useful. I would point you especially at the Blitz CSS, which was a project written by Jiminy Pan, a French ebook developer. It's very well thought out, it's extremely smart, and it's a good starting place for any CSS you might want to, any bespoke CSS you might want to use for your ebooks. And with that, I think I've wrapped up and we're ready for questions.
Thank you so much to both of you. And there's a whole bunch of questions here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the kind of more general level. Then we'll get to as many of the very specific questions here. But for those that, if you've asked a specific question and we don't get to it, don't worry about it. We capture these questions and we'll post the answers on our resources page and may be able to send it to you directly as well. So thanks to you both for your presentation for the time being, but we're not done yet. We've got some questions. So at the kind of higher level, a few questions relate to, to what extent are the sort of techniques you've shown us here and the best practices relevant for the production of both accessible PDF and EPUB? I guess people are producing both formats from one design piece of work. To what extent is this different work and distinct, or is it good practice for both export types?
What I would say for sure is that adding sort of image descriptions into your InDesign file is going to carry through to an accessible EPUB. Making sure that your file is well structured is also going to carry through. Maybe Michael has more, can fill that answer out a little bit more.
Sure. I would say that the best practices really do apply to both, because when an accessible PDF is put into its reading mode or put through some sort of assistive reading device, it's going to look at whatever structure it can. If you don't use styles, it's not going to, and map them to tags. It's not going to have that, and it's going to guess based on layout, the object geometry on the page, and a number of other things that are based on visual placement of content. And geometry does not lend itself to accessibility. So I would say that many of the guidelines apply for both. One thing I would add for accessible PDFs, because they will also serve, they're a fixed format, unlike reflowable EPUB. They will serve as, they'll be dual purpose. They're going to be presentable in a conventional way, but you want them to conform to accessibility. So what you would want to make sure that you do is use InDesign's articles panel to convey order. If you can't nest everything the way you expect and that sort of thing, there are some different tasks in the workflow, but I would say at a high level principle, the guidelines apply to both.
Thank you for that. And kind of building on that a little bit, a question from Beth. Beth is asking whether or not you're able to use one file and then generate both accessible EPUB and PDF from that file, or do you need to then change some things in order then to create the second format? So just a refinement of that first question, I guess.
What I often do when I have to make an EPUB or have to make a PDF is I make that first, because it needs to look exactly like the print page looks. And then I modify it for EPUB production. And that often means that I move things around or delete extraneous things that I'm just not going to need in the EPUB. Like running heads that have been made live on the page. I don't want those to come out in my EPUB. So you can, and a rigorous mind could do it more freely, but I often just dupe the file to make my EPUB because I'm going to make it a little bit of a mess. And that mess doesn't matter for PDF or for print, but it will help my EPUB work be a little bit easier. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So just a quick question on metadata now, and Laura, you touched on this. You described adding accessibility metadata as a post-export step. Just checking whether or not that's something that can be done from within InDesign, or is that something you have to do once you've created your EPUB?
It can't be done naturally from within InDesign. It's not built in at the moment. You can use plugins to make it work. So there's a plugin from Circular Flow called Greenlight that will help you assemble your accessibility metadata from within InDesign. And then I think there's a post-export step you have to make to sort of smooth it out and make sure that it's working in there. That said, people who want InDesign they want their EPUBs to work from InDesign without any further intervention, and who maybe don't want to look at the HTML or CSS, I would encourage you to just get used to working in HTML and CSS and editing in that accessibility metadata yourself and editing out some of the floofly bits and pieces of the HTML. It's just another language and you will get used to it. I see a lot of fear of breaking into the EPUB post-export, and if I can do it, you can do it. I promise. I'm not that smart and I'm not that technical, but it is just another language. So don't be afraid of editing the HTML and getting your hands messy in there.
So I'm moving to a bunch of questions related to images now. And this is maybe a question to Michael. You showed us adding alt text to images in a kind of per case, per image or per group of images basis. A question from Keith is, it sounds like Keith's preferred workflow is to kind of go through all the images as a batch, I suppose, working on the alt text. Is that a possible thing? Currently he does that after having exported the EPUB in another tool. Would Keith be able to go through kind of image by image, adding those in a sort of a work step?
I think that the way that you would be able to do that just with out-of-the-box tools from Adobe that would be compatible and work within InDesign would be to make your alt text your XMP description tag in something like Adobe Bridge. So, and there you could basically go into your whole folder of images, view them in Bridge with in its metadata workspace, and then just click on each image and add that to the XMP description field. Then, as I showed in the object export the object styles, if you default your the alt text setting to XMP description, all of those tagged images will bring with them their own XMP description tag. Now, those images may be tagged with other things. You may be changing existing tagging that exists. So this only works if really you're not going to be undoing another process. If Laura has anything to add on that, or any cautions, I would give her a chance to chime in too.
I have nothing to add, Michael. You're the professional on this one. Sorry.
Okay, and we've got some questions related to figure captions. So there are a few here. So Oscar was just checking, doesn't the figure tag end up in a div tag even when you've added your own figure tag? Laura kind of says, well, you know, there are so many ways. What's the recommended way of doing the figure captions? Is it as a separate text object, grouped, anchored separately after the image? How do you make that work? And Kiersey asked the question around whether there's a way of forcing or setting out the correct reading order between maybe if you have both alt text and figure captions. So there's plenty for you to get your teeth into there related to figure captions.
So the first bit about the figure tag being exported with a div tag as well, you are quite right. And that's something that I would go in and clear out. But I would also suggest that as long as the figure tag is there, then that meaningful HTML is going to be helpful at an accessibility point of view. So that div tag won't actually get in the way. It's just there for extra styling, but it won't get, as long as there's a figure tag there, it won't get in the way of accessibility. Personally, I like really clean HTML that I can go into in 2 years and know exactly what's going on. If there's extra divs and spans, then there's, you know, 3 or 4 things working on how something is styling, and it's harder to edit and update. So I like to make it as clean and simple as possible in as many iterations as possible. Read the anchoring of fig caption boxes beneath, say, an image box. That's one way to do it. That's totally possible and feasible and will work. I would just be careful that an anchored text frame that's beneath an image frame that's set in a text thread, that it may actually come out as an image. Without your intervention, without you paying attention to what the caption inside of its own text frame is doing. I have had some trouble in the past where all my captions came out as images, and I just didn't notice it quickly enough, and then got too far along in the cleanup process and had to undo all that work and go back to the InDesign file. So I would caution you about that. There are lots of ways to get the caption to travel along with the image. Almost all of them mean that you have to go into the EPUB post-export and fix things up. And now I can't remember what the third thing was, Richard. I'm so sorry.
Did we cover the reading order, a way of being able to determine the reading order of alt text and the figure caption?
That's a very good question. I think that depends somewhat on screen readers. From within InDesign, you can specify, I mean, what happens from an assistive technology point of view is it's going to hit the image and it's going to read the alt text on that image first, and then it's going to go to the caption. The fig caption has to be after the image in the hierarchy of the HTML. So that's how that gets played out naturally from within the HTML. And there's no way to organize that in InDesign, so far as I know anyway. I'm happy to be corrected on that point.
We have a question which we'll do with quite quickly because it sounds like maybe it's a general question around the support of numbered lists. So T-Bird says that they have an issue with numbered lists with the second line aligning with the first. I don't think we covered lists, which of course that semantic markup of unnumbered and numbered lists is something that people will care about in terms of accessibility. I wondered if there was a quick answer to the question from T-Bird.
Yep. So the quick answer to that is that make sure it's nested properly from within InDesign, so that you're starting a sublist to like a parent list, and then you will have to check the HTML. InDesign does a very good job of collapsing sublists and collapsing your navigation. For example, if you have nested lists in your navigation, they're going to get collapsed, and you'll have to go back in and fix those so that your navigation looks like you want it to. Make sure that your lists are actually coming out as lists. If they're styled properly as bulleted or numbered lists from within InDesign, they're going to come out as unordered or ordered lists. But nested lists are always a pain point from InDesign, I'm afraid.
Thanks for that. So we've also got some questions that relate to what if you've got an existing InDesign file, are you best to kind of start again? Are there any kind of tools that help speed up the process of applying the styles that we heard about? We're pretty short of time, so just a bit of advice around turning to content that has been developed previously. Any kind of guidance from either of you on those?
You've got to look at how bad is in the file. If the file's a complete mess, you might want to just extract the text and put it back in. But depending on the complexity of the file, you could use, there's a lot of tools in InDesign that will allow you to search for text attributes and apply a style wherever you find them. So you can use fine change to take the values of text attributes and then apply a style to anything that matches those. That could speed the process up for you. So I would leverage tools like that, search for italic formatting and create a generic italic style, and do that, do the things that'll handle the biggest problems in bulk with fine change, and then that should reduce your workload pretty significantly in cleaning up that file.
Thank you for that. That sounds like a labor saver. Okay, we're coming to the end of this session, and so thank you again to everyone who's joined us for today's webinar, and thank you to Laura and to Michael for sharing your wonderful insights and information. Coming up in the next few weeks, we have some more wonderful topics for you. On May the 27th, we have accessibility at Apple. On June the 3rd, that will be the second part in our feature exploring the revolution in born accessible digital publications. That one's entitled The Future of Accessible Publishing and Standards, Where Are We Going? And on June the 10th, we'll be learning about some legislation that will impact on one of the world's largest marketplaces. That's the European Accessibility Act, Considerations for the Publishing Industry and Benefits to Consumers Globally. You can find out more information at daisy.org/webinars, where you can also sign up to the webinar announcement mailing list to learn about new topics as we add them. If you'd like to suggest a subject, or if you're considering presenting a webinar yourself, then please email us at webinars@daisy.org. I hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.